Have you ever wondered what lies beyond the boundaries of light, where darkness never truly rests? There exists a world, a realm where life and death are small fragments of a much greater picture, where flames never cease to burn, and the whispers of spirits echo eternally in the void. In this place, justice never sleeps, and every action and every thought leaves an indelible mark. It is a domain no mortal has ever set foot in, save for one righteous and upright figure from the Bible, chosen by God and guided by angels to witness it firsthand, Enoch. Every experience, every vision, was meticulously recorded by him in the pages of the Bible. These secrets are not for the faint of heart. Do you have the courage to cross the threshold of truth? Join me as we turn the pages of the Book of Enoch to uncover realms beyond imagination. More importantly, these images will leave you with profound lessons about light and darkness, good and evil. I am certain that by the end of this video, you will find answers to the life-changing decisions you face. Subscribe to our channel to follow the mysteries in Part 5 of the Book of Enoch series. Amid the obscure and silent night, the world conceals stories that surpass human imagination. Angels, with their radiant wings and profound gaze, are the keepers of the universe's mysteries. They stand not only between light and darkness, but also bear missions that transcend mortal comprehension. Their names echo in legends, each one tied to a responsibility, a symbol of unparalleled strength and divine power. First is Uriel, a majestic angel enveloped in brilliant light. Uriel governs not only the world, but also Tartarus, the abyss of ultimate punishment. Tartarus is a bottomless chasm where condemned souls dwell eternally in darkness. Uriel stands there, regal and unyielding, like an eternal flame guarding the fragile boundary between life and death. It is said that his wings are vast enough to cover all of Tartarus, yet the light he emanates is reserved only for those deemed worthy of escaping the shadows. Meanwhile, Raphael emerges as a gentler presence, bringing the winds of healing. Raphael, the protector of souls, is the angel of salvation. Ancient tales recount how he appears in dreams, guiding lost souls back to the light. His presence is like a refreshing stream flowing through a barren desert, soothing unspoken suffering. But do not mistake his gentleness for weakness, for Raphael's gaze pierces the soul, revealing truths that cannot be concealed. Raguel, the angel of justice, stands in stark contrast. He carries the mission of avenging injustice and wrongs, especially within the celestial realm. Raguel governs the stars, ensuring they remain in their rightful places. A single star straying from its orbit could unleash uncontrollable chaos, and Raguel restores balance. It is said that with a mere flick of his hand, he can extinguish a star, casting it back into eternal darkness. Amidst the blinding light, Michael appears, wielding a flaming sword. He is the embodiment of courage, rising to defend humanity against malevolent forces. Michael confronts chaos and safeguards humanity's finest qualities: honesty, love, and hope. Legends tell of his battles with colossal demons, using his sword to divide the darkness and forge a path toward the light. Serakiel, the angel of judgment, brings an atmosphere of somber chill. He does not punish the body but the soul, discerning the sins buried deep within the mind, the dark thoughts no one dares to confess. Serakiel is the guardian of absolute truth, a realm where neither forgiveness nor justification has a place. Gabriel, with a presence both majestic and familiar, is the protector of paradise, serpents, and the cherubim. Gabriel represents life and death, serving as the bridge between heaven and earth. He is believed to blow the trumpet heralding monumental events, where change becomes inevitable. The paradise Gabriel guards a realm of pure light, admired even by the most virtuous souls. Ramiel, the guide of souls from death, symbolizes rebirth. He not only returns souls to life, but also leads them through suffering to find eternal peace. Ramiel's presence is a reminder that nothing truly ends forever, that even from the deepest darkness, a new flame can arise, carrying hope for tomorrow. These holy angels are not merely guardians but central figures in the universe's mystique. Each of their names whispers of light and darkness, narrating a world where everything is balanced on a delicate thread, a world humanity can only observe in silence and wonder. What do we truly know about the forces shaping the universe? The answer lies within the mysteries they carry, forever beyond human reach. In the impenetrable darkness of an unnamed realm, Enoch walked, each step as if venturing into a reality suspended between dream and nightmare. The world around him warped, with no sky above and no solid ground beneath. All that remained was a chaotic void where the laws of nature dissolved, leaving behind an incomprehensible and terrifying landscape. This was not a place for life or hope. It was a domain where darkness reigned supreme. Enoch's eyes fell upon a strange and haunting sight. Before him hung 7 blazing stars, each as colossal as mountains. Flames erupted from them, burning ceaselessly, as though their rage and torment were pouring forth in every inferno. These were not mere celestial bodies, but living entities, imprisoned and bound by invisible yet unbreakable chains. Enoch stood in stunned silence, his heart gripped by the horror of the scene. Finally, unable to contain himself, he spoke, his voice echoing faintly in the vastness. "For what sins are they imprisoned here? What brought them to this fate?" Uriel, the angel who had accompanied him, stepped forward from behind. The light emanating from Uriel was the only force piercing the oppressive darkness, though it could not dispel the chaos entirely. Uriel gazed at Enoch, his eyes a mixture of understanding and solemnity. "Enoch," Uriel said, his voice laden with both sorrow and authority. "Why do you ask? Why do you seek a truth you may not wish to know?" Yet Enoch could not tear his eyes away from the flames raging before him. Uriel sighed, then continued, "These stars, once part of heaven, defied the command of God. They disobeyed the laws of the universe and crossed the boundaries established by divine power. For this betrayal, they were cast down here, imprisoned in darkness and fire for 10,000 years, until the time of their judgment is fulfilled." Uriel's words cut deep into Enoch's soul like a blade. He could hardly fathom that even beings of light could fall so far, subjected to such a severe punishment. But Uriel was not finished. The angel led him onward to another place, one where even the horrors of the 7 stars were but a prelude. Before Enoch stretched a land consumed by crimson fire. The flames did not merely burn, they surged and roared, rising into great columns that pierced the darkness and plunged into an endless abyss. The crackling of the fire mingled with the wails and screams emanating from within, as though the very space was writhing in unbearable agony. Each flame, each sound, seemed to proclaim the harshness of divine justice and the boundlessness of torment. Enoch cried out in fear, "This place is too dreadful to behold. How can one endure the sight of such horror?" His voice trembled, but Uriel remained calm, his expression cold and resolute. "Enoch," Uriel replied, "this place is not for mortals to comprehend. This is the prison of the angels who betrayed the light, who fell from grace and abandoned their sanctity. They are to remain here for eternity, without forgiveness, without redemption." Uriel's words echoed like a final verdict, extinguishing any hope for the souls condemned to this place. Enoch felt an overwhelming fear, not just for what he had seen, but for what it meant. If even angels, the very beings of light and perfection, could be destroyed by sin, what chance did humanity have to escape the judgment of the Almighty? As Enoch departed this place, he knew he was not merely a witness. The terrifying images, the words of Uriel, all were etched deeply into his mind, becoming inseparable from his being. He understood that he must bring this story back, to warn humanity of the unimaginable consequences of betrayal and sin. But would they listen? Would they grasp the meaning of what he had seen? In the silence of the infinite void, Enoch walked, burdened by unanswered questions and indelible visions. His heart was heavy, but deep within, he knew he had glimpsed the truth, a truth from which no one on earth could escape. Amid the misty clouds, Enoch continued his journey, a path that led him to places even dreams dared not tread. This time, he was guided westward, where a towering, majestic mountain loomed. Yet it was not the mountain's lofty height that captured Enoch's gaze, but its peculiar structure. Rugged, sharp rocks encased for massive pits, each one vast and unnaturally smooth. These abysses, like bottomless mouths, were dark and cold, swallowing light and hope, as if holding within them a terrible secret beyond words. Enoch stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the mysterious chasms. "How can they be so smooth and so deep?" he murmured, curiosity flickering like a faint flame within him. Beside him, Raphael, the holy angel, was ready with an answer. In a voice that resonated like a chime, Raphael spoke. "These places were created with a singular purpose, to gather the souls of the departed. Here they will remain, waiting for the great day of judgment." Raphael's words pierced Enoch's mind like an arrow. He gazed into the pits, which seemed to echo with unceasing whispers. The souls imprisoned there had no physical forms, only faint fragments of memory. Yet their voices were clear and strong, rising like a hymn, a plea toward the heavens. What are they saying? What are they begging for? Enoch asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and dread. Raphael did not hesitate. They are the souls of men, the children of humanity who have passed away. Their voices cry out to heaven, pleading for justice, waiting for the day when all mysteries will be revealed. In Raphael's words, Enoch sensed a profound sorrow, as if the angel himself bore the weight of countless abandoned souls crying out amidst eternal silence. But amidst the whispers, one voice rose above all others, a voice powerful and relentless in its demand for justice. This voice, whose is it? Enoch asked, his gaze filled with curiosity, though deep within him lingered an unexplainable fear. Raphael replied, his eyes more contemplative than ever. It is the soul of Abel, the one slain by his own brother, Cain. Since that day, Abel's soul has ceaselessly cried out for justice before the heavenly court, demanding the complete destruction of Cain's lineage. Raphael's words seemed to compress the air around Enoch, making everything feel heavier. Abel, the first victim of murder in human history, continued to exist as a spirit filled with anguish, trapped in a cycle of suffering and an unyielding thirst for retribution. Abel's voice was not merely an accusation against Cain, but a chilling reminder of the cost of sin and the enduring consequences that span generations. Escaping no one, a chill ran down Enoch's spine. He could hardly fathom that events long thought to be buried in history could manifest so vividly in the spiritual realm. The souls confined here were not merely waiting for judgment. They were eternal witnesses, bearing their stories through time like indelible fragments of the tapestry of creation and destruction. As he stared into the dark abysses, Enoch could not stop pondering the true meaning of existence. Humanity, whether living or dead, seemed never to truly escape the cycle of light and darkness, sin and justice, With a solemn expression, Raphael pointed ahead, as if urging Enoch to continue his journey. Yet deep within, Enoch knew that what he had just witnessed would remain with him forever, a stark reminder of life's fragility and the mysteries of the universe he had only begun to comprehend. The dim light of the heavens could not penetrate the darkness of the abyss that Enoch now faced. These strange voids, like deep gashes on the earth, were places where souls were separated, each confined to a fate they could not alter. Enoch, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had already witnessed yet stirred by curiosity, turned to Raphael and asked, "Why are these places divided? Why can't the souls be together?" Raphael, the angel bearing the boundless knowledge of eternity, replied with a voice both cold and authoritative. These three abysses were created to separate the souls of the departed. This division reflects the nature of the lives they lived, the deeds they committed, and the destinies they determined through their choices. Raphael pointed to an abyss faintly illuminated by a gentle glow, where a pure stream flowed endlessly. "This is the place for the souls of the righteous," he said. "They are granted peace, and this stream is the water of life. These souls wait here, resting in the soft light of grace, until the final day of judgment, when they will be raised to receive the reward befitting their virtue." But not all souls enjoyed such peace. Raphael gestured toward another abyss, where thick darkness swallowed all light. "This place is for the souls of sinners," Raphael continued. "Though they were not punished during their earthly lives, here they endure relentless torment, awaiting the great day of judgment. When that day comes, their punishment will be eternal, and these souls will be confined to unending anguish." Raphael's words weighed heavily on Enoch, and the gravity of this truth pressed on his spirit. But Raphael was not finished. He guided Enoch to yet another abyss, where ceaseless voices echoed, like unending accusations. "This," Raphael said, "is the place for the souls of those who were murdered by sinners. They cry out continually for justice, accusing those who took their lives. Their voices rise to heaven, demanding punishment for the murderers. Yet they will remain here, waiting for the day when all truths are revealed." The explanation swept over Enoch's mind like a chilling wind. He gazed into each abyss, each one holding stories inescapable from judgment. Here, there was no room for concealment or forgiveness. Every action left a mark, and every mark led to an inevitable fate. Turning again to Raphael, Enoch asked with unease in his voice, "What of the souls in the final abyss?" His question trembled as Raphael's gaze shifted to the darkest chasm. "This," Raphael answered, "is the place for the greatest sinners, those who not only lived in sin but were utterly consumed by it. These souls will not perish on the day of judgment, nor will they ever be restored to life. They will remain here forever, alongside other rebellious spirits, imprisoned in absolute darkness with no hope and no forgiveness." Raphael's words sent a shiver through Enoch's being. He could feel the infinite despair emanating from the depths, as though each soul were tormenting itself in an endless cycle of suffering. As Raphael concluded, Enoch could not ignore the weight of what he had just witnessed. These abysses were not merely prisons for souls. They were symbols of the absolute division between light and darkness, virtue and sin, hope and despair. They stood as undeniable testimony to God's perfect justice, where nothing is forgotten and no deed escapes judgment. Standing before this harrowing sight, Enoch felt compelled by awe and reverence. He bowed his head and whispered a prayer. "Blessed be the Lord of glory, who reigns forever, the God of righteousness, whose justice never fades." His prayer echoed like a hymn in the stillness, blending with the wails, accusations, and whispers of the captive souls. As Raphael's light once again illuminated the path, Enoch continued his journey, carrying with him not just the story but a tremendous burden. What he had seen would forever change the way he viewed the world. A solemn reminder that no soul, great or small, could escape the gaze of eternal justice. The western darkness at the edge of the world was unlike any place Enoch had ever walked. Here, the air felt oppressed by an invisible weight, cold and filled with vague, untraceable sounds. In the eerie silence, Enoch saw a blazing light erupt in the distance. Yet this was no light of salvation or gentleness. It was a fierce flame, blood-red and roaring, surging endlessly like a living creature howling in fury. This flame did not remain still but raced forward like a raging river of fire, tearing through space and time. It moved relentlessly, day and night, as though driven by an unending wrath. Enoch could feel its heat from afar, each step closer making his skin feel as if it might burn. Yet he could not stop. The mystery of the flame drew him in, like a moth to the fire, despite the clear danger of destruction. "What is this flame?" Enoch whispered, his voice hoarse and lost in the oppressive air. "Why does it never cease?" Behind him, a low, solemn voice answered. It was Raguel, the angel accompanying him, his gaze as cold as a starless sky. "This is the flame of the West," Raguel said, his voice resonating as if rising from the depths. "A fire that never rests, never halts. It pursues all celestial bodies in the heavens that have betrayed the ordained order." At Raguel's words, the flame seemed to take on a life of its own. It was not mere fire. It was the wrath of the universe, an eternal vengeance upon those celestial beings who dared defy the will of the Most High. Trembling before the sight, Enoch struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. What did these celestial bodies do to deserve such punishment? He asked, his voice filled with dread. Raguel stared deeply into the fire, his eyes reflecting its crimson glow. "They abandoned their orbits," he said, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "They no longer obeyed the laws of heaven, and this flame is their punishment. It chases them ceaselessly, forcing them back into their rightful place or consuming them entirely. This is the justice of the universe, unyielding, unforgiving." Raguel's words echoed in Enoch's mind, and he could not tear his gaze away from the flame surging before him. This river of fire was no accident. It was the embodiment of an unseen force, a colossal hand guiding all things in the silent, undeniable grip of order. Within the blaze, Enoch thought he could hear anguished cries, desperate pleas of celestial beings being pursued and torn apart by unrelenting justice. The flame, with its boundless power, seemed to devour everything in its path. Its ferocity left Enoch breathless. Yet he could not turn away. He had to look, had to understand. Even as fear flooded his mind. Is there no escape for any celestial being from this flame? Enoch asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though afraid to provoke the fury of the fire. Raguel turned to him, his eyes burning like twin torches in the darkness. "No one escapes this justice," he replied. "Every action has its cost, and every deviation must be corrected. This flame is the embodiment of balance. It does not rest, for justice never rests." Enoch stood still, overwhelmed. In the crimson glow of the flame, he felt the presence of something far greater than he had ever known. This was no mere natural phenomenon. It was a living force, the will of the cosmos, a terrifying reminder that nothing escapes the watchful gaze of the Most High. The celestial beings pursued by this flame were a testament to the fragility of power, even among the most revered of entities. As Raguel guided Enoch away from the scene, the flame continued to burn, unyielding and undiminished. Enoch turned for one final glance, his heart filled with both fear and awe. The image of the flame burned itself into his memory. An indelible warning: all things are under the control of the universe, and no one, no matter how exalted, can escape judgment. In the cold darkness of the west, the crackling roar of the flame echoed, a chilling whisper of eternity. In the darkness of distant lands, Enoch continued his unending journey, venturing into a realm where neither life nor death seemed bound by natural laws. He walked through a range of fiery mountains, their flames flickering endlessly, unyielding to the passage of day or night. These mountains, both majestic and menacing, seemed to guard a terrifying secret no one dared to approach. With each step, waves of searing heat enveloped Enoch, yet the light and mystery of the land beyond drew him onward. After passing through the fiery range, Enoch entered a strikingly different place, a vast valley surrounded by 7 magnificent mountains. Each mountain possessed a supernatural beauty, unlike anything he had ever seen. They were adorned with brilliant gemstones, shimmering under the dim light of the sky. 3 mountains to the east and 3 to the south rose in perfect alignment, creating a remarkable symmetry. But amidst them stood a single, towering peak, rising so high it seemed to touch the heavens. Its surface was smooth, resembling an enormous, divine throne. Encircling the tallest mountain were rows of trees exuding an intoxicating fragrance, a scent unlike anything Enoch had encountered before. It was not the aroma of earthly flowers, but a mysterious allure that wove its way into his very breath, compelling him to draw closer. Yet it was not merely the fragrance that captivated him. The trees themselves were extraordinary. Their leaves were vibrant, untouched by decay. Their blossoms radiated mesmerizing colors, and their fruits gleamed like jewels, resembling dates but glowing brilliantly in the soft light. Enoch marveled at the trees, his gaze filled with wonder. He could not help but exclaim, "These trees are so beautiful. Their scent is heavenly. Their blossoms seem eternal, and their fruits, they are like a miracle." As his words hung in the air, a deep, resonant voice spoke from behind him. It was Michael, one of the greatest and most revered of angels. With a commanding presence, his shining wings spread wide, Michael stepped forward. His voice rang out like a bell in the mystical expanse. "Enoch," Michael said, his eyes reflecting profound understanding, "you are gazing upon one of the greatest mysteries of the heavens. These trees are unlike any others, and their fruits are not meant for mortals." Michael's words deepened Enoch's curiosity, and he could not help but ask, "What are these trees? Why are they placed here, among these mountains?" Michael smiled, though his smile carried an unsettling sense of enigma that made Enoch shiver. "This mountain is the throne, and this tree is the symbol of eternal life. Its fragrance soothes all pain, and its fruit is a source of unending strength. But not all may approach it, and not all are worthy to touch it." Enoch stood in silent awe, his heart brimming with reverence and wonder. He could not stop himself from pondering. What greater secrets did these trees hold? Could this be the place where the order of life and death was decreed? If the fruit truly granted eternal life, who would be deemed worthy to partake of it? Michael offered no further explanation. His piercing gaze shifted toward the highest mountain, where the throne awaited. "Remember well what you have seen," Michael said, his voice resonating as if from both heaven and the abyss. "Know that every part of this world bears meaning and balance. Nothing exists without purpose, and nothing is created without a divine intent." These words left Enoch feeling as though he stood on the threshold of something far greater than himself, something beyond the comprehension of humanity. The image of the mountains, the fragrant trees, and the towering peak crowned with a throne etched itself deeply into his soul. This was not merely a vision but a reminder. that this world is far grander, more mysterious, and more fearsome than mankind could ever fathom. As Enoch departed from the sacred land, his heart was filled not only with reverence, but also with an unshakable restlessness. He understood that what he had just witnessed was but a fragment of the far greater mysteries that lay ahead. And as the light of the distant mountains faded, Enoch seemed to hear an invisible whisper, a haunting reminder that he had touched the edge of the forbidden, a place where light and darkness waged their eternal battle. Amid the thick darkness of the sacred mountains, Enoch stood in awe before a scene that filled him with both wonder and dread. Atop the tallest peak, surrounded by a forest of trees, stood a mysterious aromatic tree, rising above its surroundings like a being beyond imagination. Its trunk shimmered as though made of precious gems, and its fragrance enveloped Enoch's senses, drawing him into a realm that seemed otherworldly. This was no ordinary scent. It was overpowering, sweet to the point of terror, as if it sought to bind his soul to something eternal. Enoch stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the blossoms adorning the tree. They resembled tiny lanterns emitting a soft glow, each petal pulsing with life. The fruits, glistening and jewel-like, hung delicately, their shapes akin to dates but bathed in an unearthly light, as though awaiting a hand to pluck them. As Enoch moved another step closer, a chill wind cut through the air, sharp and biting. From the shadows, Michael emerged, his radiant wings tearing through the darkness. His eyes were cold, the gaze of a sentinel who brooked no defiance. "Enoch," Michael said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying through the stillness. "Why do you seek to know this tree? Why do you desire a truth that humanity is not meant to uncover?" Enoch halted, his eyes betraying both his relentless curiosity and a fear he could not conceal. "I wish to know everything," he replied, his voice trembling yet resolute. "But above all, I wish to know about this tree. What is it? And why is it here?" Michael studied him for a long moment, his piercing gaze unyielding. Then, with a voice like a whisper carried from the abyss, he replied, "The mountain upon which you stand is the throne of the Most High, and this tree, it is not merely aromatic but a sacred symbol. The fragrance you sense, sweet yet perilous, is the essence of eternal life. But heed this warning: no mortal may touch it until the final day of judgment." Michael's words cut through Enoch's thoughts like blades. He gazed at the tree with indescribable reverence and fear. Then, on the day of judgment, what will happen? Enoch asked, his voice faint, as if lost in the oppressive darkness. Michael stepped forward, his form melding with the tree's spectral light. "On that day," he said, "the Most High will sit upon this throne. Justice will be restored to all, and this tree will be granted to the righteous. Its fruit will become a source of life, nourishing them and transforming them into immortal beings. But know this: the tree is not for the unworthy. To sinners, its fragrance will not bring peace but will ignite a fire that consumes their souls." A shiver ran through Enoch. The tree, with its captivating beauty and enchanting fragrance, was not only a gift but also a warning. It promised salvation while concealing the power of destruction. But Michael was not finished. His voice grew colder, as though a frigid wind had swept over the mountaintop. "When this tree is brought to the holiest place, within the temple of the Eternal One, the chosen will enter, rejoicing in everlasting joy. Its fragrance will permeate their very being, making them impervious to pain, disease, or terror. Yet only the worthy will partake of this blessing." Michael's words carried the weight of both hope and dread, echoing like a solemn decree. Enoch bowed his head, no longer daring to look directly at the tree, though its image was seared into his mind as a forewarning. The aromatic tree, with its supernatural beauty and otherworldly fragrance, was more than a symbol of eternal life. It marked the fragile boundary between light and darkness, between salvation and destruction. Lifting his eyes, filled with reverence, Enoch whispered, "Blessed be the Most High, the King of eternity, who has created all this for the righteous." His prayer hung in the air, a faint melody amidst the whispers of darkness and light. As Enoch turned to leave, the tree remained, silent and majestic, a witness to all that had been and all that was yet to come. In the dense darkness, its fragrance lingered, sweet yet perilous, a constant reminder that the greatest secrets of the universe could never fully belong to mankind. Within the mystical pages of the Book of Enoch, where light and darkness intertwine in a dance of profound mystery, every vision Enoch beheld seemed to deliver a harsh yet necessary warning to all. These were not merely tales of fiery mountains, shadowed abysses, or the eternal tree of life. They were vivid symbols of an undeniable truth. Every soul carries a destiny shaped by its own choices. As Enoch traversed the dark chasms where souls were divided, he witnessed the silent screams of sinners, those who could not hide their misdeeds from the unwavering gaze of eternal justice. These abysses, black and frigid, were where souls wept in unending darkness, awaiting a judgment they knew would never favor them. Imagine the suffocating silence there, heavy as though time itself had ceased, leaving only agony behind. Then Enoch stood before the flame that never rests, a raging river of fire pursuing celestial bodies that had strayed from their ordained paths. This flame was not merely a symbol of judgment, but the embodiment of unyielding retribution. It reminded all that the cosmos does not forgive those who betray its order. Picture its searing red light, a blinding slash across the darkness, burning fiercely as if cursing those who dared overstep their bounds. Yet not all was shrouded in shadow. Atop the tallest mountain, where the throne of the Most High resides, stood the aromatic tree, its fragrance so enchanting it numbed every sense. This was no mere tree, but a symbol of hope and eternal life. Its glowing fruits, radiant like precious gems, and its ever-blooming flowers were rewards for those who had endured the darkness, souls chosen to enter the sacred realm. But that sweet fragrance was also a warning. Not all could touch it, and to the unworthy, it would become a flame that consumed their souls. Every image Enoch witnessed was a fragment of a harsh and wondrous truth. Nothing exists without leaving a mark. No act goes without consequence. The imprisoned souls, the hunted celestial bodies, the righteous rewarded with the fruits of the tree of life, all stood as testimony to the universe's perfect yet unforgiving balance. The lesson from Enoch's journey is not to sow fear, but to remind us that every choice, no matter how small, shapes our destiny. Will you face the river of fire, the darkness of the abysses, or will you stand in the light, breathing in the immortal fragrance of the tree of life? In this universe, the eyes of justice never blink, and the flame never ceases. So look closely at the path you tread. Each step is an imprint, every act a declaration to the cosmos. When the day of judgment arrives, where will you stand? Among the cries in the darkness, or amidst the fragrance of the tree of life on the highest peak? That choice, mysterious and daunting, is yours alone to make. Enoch's journey does not end here. Every step he takes, every vision he beholds, reveals another fragment of the great tapestry of heaven and its unimaginable secrets. Yet what we have seen is merely the beginning, a whisper from the darkness, a faint glimmer in the boundless void. What other mountains will Enoch climb? What souls will he encounter? And what secrets lie hidden beyond the final gates of heaven, the eternal flame, the tree of life, and the throne of the Most High are but the surface of a deep ocean filled with mysteries. The universe is not merely a place where light and darkness coexist, but a battleground of relentless conflict between justice and rebellion, hope and fear. Continue this journey with Enoch through unopened gates, uncharted lands, and secrets yet to be revealed. Each new chapter will take you deeper into the supernatural, where even imagination cannot follow. Will you dare to look into the darkness and find the light? Or will you lose yourself in the labyrinth of forgotten souls? This journey is not for the faint-hearted, but if you are ready to face the truth, take the next step. What lies ahead will leave you trembling, awestruck, and unable to turn away. Do not let the secrets of heaven slip past unexplored. Follow the next chapter of the Book of Enoch and uncover what lies beyond human understanding. Please subscribe to our channel to enjoy more captivating Bible stories from us.